Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar sponsored by the Alliance for Workforce Development with a focus on Butte County. Dr. Eiler, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Vicki. Folks, welcome, and I want to thank Chabin for putting this out and for Alliance for Workforce Development for sponsoring this. What I'm going to do for the next half hour or so, and I'm going to talk to you about where the macroeconomics of the United States are going and what some of the forecasts may be, and some of the data that have just recently come out and also to watch going forward. I'm going to talk about some of the debate items that the governor's office, County of Butte, City of Chico, and almost every other municipality in the United States is considering in terms of reopening their economies and what way to do that. Some of the risks in terms of industries locally that you're going to want to watch and think about where economic development can focus its efforts. I'm going to talk about the recovery aspects of the Camp Fire and how that may or may not be affected by the recovery in Butte County otherwise from COVID-19. And we'll end talking about some of the data to watch and some of the other aspects of Butte County with respect to other risks and also the next few months in terms of the evolution of Chico State's decision-making and how the overall county may, see some changes because of that. Now, that's our agenda. I just talked about this, so let's get right into it. This is a tale of three policies, and the reactions we're having to those are basically dictating the outcomes for our economy. So monetary and fiscal policy are meant to be positive forces. So when you hear about interest rates going down to zero, or what we're calling the zero lower bound in economics, and you hear about these huge fiscal policy packages, which I'll talk about in more detail in a bit, the sum of those parts are really meant to provide positive economic energy once the social policies have been mitigated or have subsided. From past recessions, we know that the combination of those two policies can be very powerful in terms of providing recovery energy. They come with some costs, but some of those costs we did not quite see in the last decade after the Great Recession in terms of inflation and relatively high or quickly rising interest rates. But we may see some of that action as we evolve into the rest of this decade. But for right now, we're more worried about just getting out of the hole we're slowly, and we'll see in a couple of months, very quickly falling into. And I'll talk later about the depth and the duration of that. The social policies are the negative. And at the end of the day, we're expecting these two policies together and their multiplier effects to have a larger economic impact than the negative of the social policies. One piece of data that a lot of places have watched have been these new claims for unemployment insurance. And the data I'm about to show you is for the US and California. I'll come back and talk about Butte County in a minute. But if you look at the US and California, the evolution of these data normally are, and with very good logic, a harbinger of what happens in unemployment. These are point counts of people on a quarterly average that actually walk into EDD and ask for their unemployment insurance to start. So here's the US data. And you can see that there's three bumps in these data. When these data rise, that's bad for the economy. Here's California in contrast with the same basic bump around where the last decade we saw a quick rise in the middle of 2014, which quickly subsided. Here are the recessions since 1986. There's been three: the Gulf War I recession, the dot-com recession, and the Great Recession. And you can see how the blue line wants to move up either during or right before the recessions begin. But the spike on the far right-hand side really showcases how many people have asked for unemployment insurance in the last, let's say, 12 weeks, because this is meant to be a rolling quarter average. But the idea is that how that actually ultimately transmits itself to the unemployment rate depends on how we rehire. So we've been watching these data for the last 5 or 6 weeks. We've been watching them take this wild rocket ride. And now we're transitioning to looking at how unemployment and so-called continued claims evolve. When people are on unemployment insurance, how long do they stay? Well, the black line here shows that against the unemployment rate in blue for California specifically. So here's the Gulf War I recession, the dot-com recession, and the Great Recession in historic contrast. Now, you can see that the hill climbed in the Gulf War I recession and in the dot-com recession for continued claims and unemployment stuck around a little while at the peak versus what happened in the Great Recession. The Great Recession just took longer to get to the peak, and it felt more powerful in terms of that. But once it got to the peak, it subsided very quickly. Why? Because fiscal and monetary policy got to the top of that peak and started to help jobs come back. And so what we've done in the last 8 weeks is basically the same thing that in the Great Recession took us 2 years to do, is combine those policies together to fight what we knew was a common economic problem, which in this case is our decision socially to shut down and spare our healthcare system a lot of grief. One piece of data that has recently come out is GDP growth. So let's look at this estimate with historic perspective to try to get an idea about how a county like Butte County may be affected ultimately by the contraction of income and the contraction of productivity in our macro economy across the United States. These data are from 1990 forward and are quarterly, and they showcase the seasonally adjusted annual rate of growth, meaning that this is the percent change from the previous quarter multiplied by 4 to give a running, in a sense, average rate of growth after seasonal adjustments have taken place. You can see that this is the Gulf War I recession, the dot-com recession, and the Great Recession again. But the depth of the Great Recession was much deeper than at least this first cut. However, we're expecting the next quarter to be much more powerful in terms of the negative effects. So this is what we're watching with respect to dating the recession, but also thinking about how long the recession might last, and that's critical. Now, let's look at what variables contributed to that change historically. This is just from 2000 forward. Notice this, consumption, our household expenditures, are generally about 65 to 68, sometimes 70, depending on the situation in the economy, % of total GDP. You can see the far right-hand side, the blue column moving down, is larger than any of the negative columns in the Great Recession, which I'll outline in just a minute, and in the dot-com recession. The key here is that consumption going down means there's a lot of negative pressure on GDP to fall also. And I'll break that down in a little bit more detail in just a bit. Here's business investment. The combination of these two is a very large majority of our GDP. And generally in recession, they tend to follow each other. Consumption goes down, investment goes down, and then investment gets hammered because as consumption falls, businesses are less likely to build up inventories or to expand because they're concerned about consumer confidence. So investment, as you'll notice in the Great Recession in the middle of this graph, fell further than consumption did. This is government spending, which you can see has had sort of an episodic way of contributing to GDP growth, but very little has happened thus far in these data for the first quarter. The second quarter, you're likely to see much larger boosts. And then exports have fallen because we've sold less to the world, but imports have fallen because we've bought less from the world. So in kind of a funny way, imports have fallen in such a way to contribute to a positive aspect of keeping our income at home, but the other 4 variables have provided a negative. So are we expecting more change negatively? Yes. This is the weaving of GDP overall over that time, the dot-com recession, the Great Recession in historic perspective, and where we were in the first estimate of last quarter. Let's break down consumption into 2 component pieces. One is how we consume goods. So same data that we saw initially, 1990 forward, all 3 recessions since 1990. But you can see that in the Great Recession, which is the third shaded area, the percent change at its depth was much deeper than what we've seen thus far for goods. Now, why is that important? That's important because what we've seen in the first rounds of the COVID-19 reaction, we've seen this transition to buying more, let's say, groceries and non-durable goods than durable. The problem with that is that we won't get much economic impact out of non-durable purchases. We tend to do that already. But the percentage change here was relatively low, which means some of our retail has been preserved in this thus far. A lot of it is going to be challenged very deeply soon. Now, that's completely different than services. So services, think of this as being professional services all the way down to personal services like hair salons, nail salons, but also including hotels, restaurants, and other, let's say, tourism attractions. This is what that looks like over that same span of time with the 3 recessions. So, sorry, I did that kind of quick. There's the 3 recessions. You can see in the Great Recession, services actually had less of an impact than goods, but this time we're seeing services deeply affected. So for a place like Butte County that does rely on 2 sets of tourists, natural tourism versus during the summer, coming up to enjoy the river or going toward the mountains, or just coming to Butte County generally, whether it be Oroville or Chico primarily, what we really want to think about is how Chico State also has tourists in the sense that the students come, are there for a while, and then leave. How much of their consumption of services is going to be a problem for Butte County, given that there's going to maybe be this semester where we had to shelter in place and students went home, and how the evolution of the university, I work for a state university also, we're going through the same questions. What is that going to do to the local economy? Okay, Two words to remember: depth and duration. All the policies, all the movement by our government, all the movement by your governor is really meant to keep the depth and duration minimized. That's key. Now, here are some forecasts about that. The National Association of Business Economists, which tend to be kind of a blue chippy forecast, put this out in April. Notice that the first line, which I'll now highlight below this, for GDP growth was off a little bit at the middle, but was under what the 5 lowest business economists expected in the first quarter, which means it probably ended up somewhere in the middle of the distribution between the median and the lowest. Now, the shaded area shows you what quarters 2 through 4 for this year look like, and you can see the lowest are very, very negative. The highest are relatively optimistic, meaning amazing change. And then we have the median forecast, which generally speaking is not only by definition the middle of the distribution, but also might be the most likely because of being in the middle. Now, that is a relatively hard hit in quarter 2. So given that we were at negative 4.8 in quarter 1, we're expecting quarter 2 to be probably somewhere in the 30-ish range. We'll see. But juxtaposed to that is what's going to happen in labor markets. And these two are tied to each other to a certain extent. You see in the second shaded area to the right, the unemployment rate in the median forecast is forecasted to be 12%, then to be 10.5 and 9.5, meaning that we won't get out of this year really much under 10% as a nation. And that's if the median forecast plays out based on GDP growth in the far left-hand column of the data. If you look at the far right-hand column, which is the 5 highest forecasts for unemployment, you'll notice that those are in the very high teens, or actually 20% for the nation, which is extremely high. California would probably be a little higher than that if those high forecasts play out that way. So we are expecting in California to be somewhere in the teens in April, maybe the high teens. We will find out. The unemployment insurance claims, as I said earlier, is a harbinger of those data coming. So we will see whether or not we get up that high, but we should be expecting very ugly data for the next couple of quarters minimum. Part of that is because we have not reopened yet. And so we're sort of suffering economically to gain the benefits of not over impacting our healthcare systems and potentially being shut down or having large amount of detriment over time. Again, that depth and duration idea. Well, a lot of municipalities and the state of California and the United States are all wrestling with the costs and benefits of reopening. We don't want to get reinfected, so that's a major cost. The risk is there that we will reinfect and see the number of cases spike again, the number of deaths spike again, and potentially overload our healthcare system, the things we were trying to avoid. In the medium term, the cost of reopening is that we'll have to shut down again. If we get reinfected, we'll be right back where we are right now, but even worse, like where we were 4 weeks ago. And we will see how that might actually act as a double dip in our economy, which is 100% what we're trying to avoid. We don't want any further negative economic impacts. Finally, in the long term, we know the cost of business is going to change. We do not want to exacerbate that increase in the cost of doing business. So by reopening, we need to reopen in such a way to minimize the long-term impact if we want to get our capacity back online and get back to where we thought we were going to be sooner than later. And of course, the tease here is that the benefits are just seemingly sitting there waiting to be taken, because if we get our economy back started again, what we have jobs and spending start up and tax revenues flowing again to our municipalities. Well, part of that is going to depend on travel and just how our economy opens up. But we certainly would benefit by having it open up and start those jobs and spending again. And that's exactly what we've seen in places that really have either not slowed down that much or have started to slowly reopen. They are taking some more risk. In the medium term, we're hoping that if the virus reappears, we will be able to minimize the impact of that with the idea that we can basically gain the benefits of time now, prepare for the reinfection, assuming it's coming, and mitigate the problems of reinfection later by adapting to those potential issues now. In the long term, and this is the beauty of this on the benefit side, will we see adaptation and innovation and entrepreneurship that'll help everybody out and reduce those long-term costs because we have new businesses focused on mitigating those costs. Well, for businesses out there, there's a lot of vulnerability, and we're really looking toward the medium and long term. So biggest impacts right away are travel, hospitality, your visitor supporting industries, and airlines and your airports. So if you think about how much the Chico airport has had to go through in terms of flights building up, flights going down, flights rebuilding, where they go, and just having more of a commitment by both the local area and the airlines to keep those flights going, the reduction in travel is going to put a real pinch on that going forward for Butte County. So we will see how we go through the rest of this year. But that's the one industry you should be very worried about. Healthcare is another one, because healthcare has been waiting for cases that really have not come at the volume we expected. We've been really good at doing shelter in place. But this other side of it is we haven't been able to go see our chiropractor, our dentists, our other outpatient services. Just having elective surgeries has been muted. We need that to happen to kind of spark up our healthcare system on the other side than acute care. The government is going to be very troubled on the other side of this. Chico State as one example of that. On the worker side, our lower wage workers, and especially those who are marginally homed or marginally in their cars, are going to be very much taken to the borderline if they lose their jobs or have, let's say, less potential income as a result of all this for a longer period of time. And unemployment insurance, when it comes, may not solve general problems of the household if it's relatively low income to start with. And then finally, though, here's a positive piece of news. It might be that rural California goes through kind of a renaissance, and I'll come back to this at the end. But because the infection rates were relatively low in more rural places, it's possible that the restart will be stronger. But we can't forget that even rural California, as isolated sometimes as it may be, definitely depends on the outside world in Butte County because of the university and because of the way that it depends on the flow of people, especially in the summer. You don't want to mitigate those. In other words, you don't want to leave a situation where you're not ready for visitors correctly because you don't see them coming that much. You want to prepare for that. And hopefully as California opens, we will be receiving more visitors, an opportunity, again, I'll talk about in a minute. But in the front end, we know that there's going to be some triage. So tourism in our downtowns are definitely places that are going to be hurting for at least the next couple of months, maybe the next couple of quarters if the summer does not play out well from a visitor standpoint. Again, looking at Chico as an example of this, the city of Chico tends to be more quiet in the summer because the students are not there naturally. But we want to watch and see if there are going to be people moving around California that otherwise would have gone to other national or international locations that suddenly don't want to get on a plane. Is it possible that through the correct marketing strategy, we can attract visitors that would have made different choices that now just want to get in a car and get out of the house? And going to Chico and getting on the river and taking on some of the mitigation issues in terms of the PPE that we're all going to have to wear for a while or potentially for some time, but being outdoors. Chico and Butte County have always been an outdoorsy place. I mean, think about Oroville and going to the lake, all that stuff. Having those options is potentially a really good economic development asset right now for Butte County because people may be making more local, regional choices, if you will, than going national or international. Construction's another one. We need to make sure that our building continues because construction is a great value-add industry alongside of manufacturing that generates job opportunities not only inside the industry, but from its multiplier effects. So thinking about that, are there workforce development opportunities on the other side of this? If relatively low-wage workers are going to lose their jobs in Butte County, can Butte College, Chico State University provide workforce development for an expansion of industry that otherwise is a little bit more value-added, and in a sense, upskill these folks? We have manufacturing, we have healthcare, we have construction, and that goal of upskilling is something we've seen in the past. So when the car industry contracted in Michigan at the beginning and during the last recession, the state of Michigan took on an initiative to try to provide upskilling or workforce development for folks to become biotech workers and tried to expand that around the university system in Michigan and some of the sort of fledgling biotech companies that were in Michigan at the time. And they did a pretty good job of that. So it is a model to look at and say, if we see these industries fading, do we have the capacity, commercial real estate available, investment available, the right workforce available, potentially the right technology available to generate more upskilling and more jobs in places that we wouldn't have thought as expansion areas, but now we have a workforce that is hungry for career change, and we may have the conditions under which industry wants to make that change in Butte County. It may not be rapid growth, but it is a place to think about combining economic and workforce development together. Now, coming back to the data, here is a way to think about when we're watching those unemployment insurance claims and how that might affect local unemployment rates. So this is from 2002 forward to February this year. And I'm not showing you March because March is a relatively quick spike, but it's a spike that's similar to what happened during right after the fires. So you'll notice here that this is the Great Recession, where the peak of unemployment happened in early 2010 and the peak of the unemployment rate happened in early 2012, about 12 months difference. But the fires saw the same spike, and there was very little change in unemployment. So one of the questions I can ask is this more like a classic recession, or is this more like a natural disaster? And unfortunately, it's kind of like a weird combination of both. It is a natural disaster because of its generality, is now creating conditions that look like a normal recession because we are reducing consumption and investment as a result of sheltering in place and changing consumer confidence. However, unfortunately, Butte County has some recent experience with natural disaster, and what it really is recognizing partnerships and economic and workforce development working in sync is the easiest way to get back on track. So if you look at this, though, you're going to see some numbers in unemployment insurance claims for Butte County over the next couple months that look very reminiscent and actually beyond what happened right after the fires. Looking at the data that did come out in March, and these data now, even though they're only about 3.5 weeks old, or might as well have been when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth, we're going to see changes in labor force and unemployment and employment that look very nasty over the next couple months of data. Next Friday, these data will come out for Butte County. But you can see that it was a little bit more than than California in terms of changes in labor force and employment, but not as much in unemployment. We're expecting that to rise relatively quickly soon. That's because there's been some net shifting in the labor market. But this is just for the residents of Butte County. This does not look at the jobs that are in Butte County. These are the people that live there. Now, if you look at the jobs that are in Butte County, these are the changes. So the shifts in employment as far as the end of March did not quite hit, but something to recognize, not like the state did, something to recognize is that the rural parts of California tend to lag a little bit. And that's why I said this is kind of a combination. In a normal historic recession, rural California tends to lag California on average, and then the wave finally comes. But California itself as a state is going to be hurt specifically in its urban areas because that's where a lot of the economic juice flows for the county, for the state. And as a result of that, the numbers in California are probably going to be uglier quicker than parts of rural California. But Butte County's done okay in the data thus far, but don't expect it to last. Now, because of the fires, Butte County is kind of a special case for recovery, but there are some positives as well. As far as manufacturing jobs, Butte County has seen an uptick versus the state. So it used to follow the state pretty well. And I'm just showing you these data on a monthly basis that are seasonally adjusted from 2000 forward. And you can see that the first decade of the 2000s were basically on par with the state. But then over time, manufacturing has become more important. Economic development in Butte County has become more aggressive and actually had done a really good job of attracting and retaining manufacturing jobs versus the state on average. This is a positive piece. It suggests that Butte County can handle an expansion of manufacturing as a place that differentiates itself from other parts of California because it's above the average the last 10 years in terms of growth. Unfortunately, on the flip side of that, there is some sales tax or some taxable sales exposure in terms of risk. What I want to show you here is that if we think that hospitality is a place where there's risk exposure for the local community, whether it be jobs, businesses, or municipal budgets, retail and restaurant taxable sales is one way to think about whether or not you have that risk. Here's Butte County, about 77% on average over the last 10 years, quarterly data, as far as how much the total taxable sales in the county depend on retail and restaurant for those sales. Here's the city of Chico, which makes sense. It's a little higher than the county on average because a lot of the retail and restaurant establishments are there in the city. And then here's California, not that much lower. So there's marginal risk, but it's still risk higher than the average. So on the flip side of it, manufacturing looks like a place that could continue to burgeon in Butte County. Retail and restaurants might have a little bit more of a slide than the state on average because of this exposure. Hence, the triage piece, getting to those types of businesses and trying to figure out what they need is critical now. Let's talk about housing. This is how housing moved in terms of looking at March 2020 data and thinking 1 year, 2 years, and back to basically the bottom about 10 years ago. What's been the growth? Well, for Butte County, this is what it's looked like. The 2-year growth has been one of the shining stars in terms of California, but it unfortunately came on the other side of the fires with a contraction of supply. Since the bottom, people have gained wealth, but of course some of that has been fire driven, and last year things started to slow down a little bit in terms of price ascension, and the state actually did a little better over the last 12 months than did Butte County, but Butte County was much more strong and aggressive in terms of price growth the 2 years in sum. The idea is that the housing market in Butte County, while it might look strong on the surface, is obviously still going through some of the machinations post-fire. And there, you may feel like that there's some, let's say, instability in housing markets as a result of this. That's probably true. Every housing forecast out there right now, though, is for relatively stable prices otherwise, because the supposition is that supply and demand are both going to contract basically hand in hand to keep prices relatively stable. Zillow is actually right now has very double-digit growth for the next 12 months, as a matter of fact, in terms of forecast for Butte County. So it's actually seeing a pretty good bump up in prices. And part of that might be because people are leaving the urban areas and going toward rural California once this all clears and they're able to sell their house and move. We will see if that phenomenon actually takes place. Now, what I want to do is I want to give you some scenarios as I start to wrap up about growth of jobs in California, depending on what happens next. So there's a tricky scenario I have in which some of the data I showed you before in terms of the forecast plays itself out on the negative, but that we actually start getting our economy back. And by maybe mid-2021, we're back to 90% of baseline. That's the tricky scenario. The ugly scenario is that we have a reinfection and we go back to shelter in place. But as I show you here in bold, one of the things that might happen in rural California is not only was rural California not as heavily affected, but by taking on whatever social restrictions are necessary going forward, businesses and workers will be prepared for the next one in such a way that may be very little need to shelter in place in rural California. Now, one of the tricks in all that is whether or not the state has learned lessons from this first round and thinks about those in having general shelter in place or having something that's a little bit more muted, because we've all made adjustments in the way we do business. We will see. But if we do see that double dip, it is going to get a little more ugly. This is looking from 1998 forward. I'm going to show you the baseline was the original forecast of the California Department of Finance. They're now revising this forecast, but this is where all the data before February, or actually I take it back, before January, told these forecasters where we were going. And I happen to sit on the team that does a lot of the final vetting of this. So that's where we thought we were going in terms of jobs, sort of slow and steady forward to 2023. Here's the tricky scenario. We have a very sharp decline and then the slow climb back up where, as I said before, by mid-2021, we're basically 90% back to baseline and then very close to it by 2022, if not on baseline again and going forward. But here's the ugly scenario. The ugly scenario has that double dip in it in such a way that we kind of lose jobs now and then we lose them again. And if that happens, notice the Great Recession was a very smooth movement. This is very violent down and might stay there, have the same shape in terms of job loss as the Great Recession, but happen in a more compact time frame and then start climbing up. But if we do have that deviation from the baseline, it's going to take us back to jobs numbers that look more like 2015 than 2019, unfortunately. And we'll have this sort of like 5 lost years of job growth. Now, just to be clear, the municipal concerns are not just in taxable sales, even though that's part of it. It's possible that we will see a further downturn of taxable sales if you think about the bed tax or TOT as a very specific type of sales tax. We should expect that, folks. Further, is construction going to slow down? So from a rebuild standpoint, Butte County needs to think very deeply about how it's going to try to facilitate construction at a very fast pace to continue whatever rebuild momentum there is and potentially expand that on the other side. On the developer side, if local government is a relative partner with developers, they're going to want to develop given the cost of credit, but it's really going to boil down to what is the housing market ultimately going to do to give that final ROI to developers. The cost of social assistance to our municipalities is going to rise. We're going to see our low-wage workers demand more social assistance, unfortunately. And then finally, we're going to be looking very closely at our pension systems. Are we going to have more pressure, or are we going to have shifts in the way that government works? We will see. As a wrap-up, folks, we're trying to avoid the loss of capacity. We know job loss is coming. We know business loss is going to come. We're hoping to mitigate that and then get our jobs back. And what we don't want to do is we don't want the two sort of feeding off of each other to lead to more job loss and ultimately people leaving Butte County once and for all, because between the fires, PSPS, changes in housing prices, changes in jobs, changes in business, and all this negative, you want to preserve the capacity of your economy, and you have to preserve both the businesses that serve the local residents and visitors, but also the folks that work in those businesses. So this has already happened as a first reaction. We don't want to have this exacerbate the problem, and we certainly don't want when both sides of the market are feeding off of each other. I started with talking about policy, and one of the policies has been a business lending portfolio. One specifically was called Paycheck Protection Program lending. And you may have heard of this or maybe even participated in it, and you may have already got your check. Well, the New York Federal Reserve Branch actually just put out a study earlier this week that provided a map of the United States to at least try to showcase, because a lot of questions I get is, why I put my paperwork in, what's going on with the money? Well, California has lagged a little bit against other states. The red states are the ones that have seen the larger proportion of the folks that actually put in for the loans getting them, where the lighter colored states are ones in which they have a lower percentage. And what these economists decide, or looked at the data and said, this is one of the key linkages, is the number of community banks and credit unions there are per person in those red states and on the darker colored states generally than there are in the ones that are lighter, meaning our community banks and credit unions are really delivering that PPP lending to the businesses that need it at a very fast pace, maybe because they're a little bit more nimble than larger banks, but larger banks are definitely catching up. So this is just one way of seeing how that first tranche of money played out, but all banks are now very much moving the money, and then we will see whether or not it helps preserve our businesses and our jobs. So folks, what to watch? The labor market numbers are going to be ugly, and there's no way of getting around it. We just have, by contracting demand, it puts a lot of businesses at risk, and businesses look at labor, unfortunately, first as a place to cut if they're going to try to stay in business. And if they don't stay in business, then everybody loses a job. About 30 million people in the last 6 weeks, folks, have actually put in for unemployment across the United States, and about 3.8 million in California. So we're expecting some pretty nasty unemployment numbers. This is just an additional shock to Butte County, which is already still kind of slowly rolling forward in terms of rebuild, recovery, reclamation, and really coming out of the literal ashes, unfortunately. But we will see if rural California, where Butte County is one community in that rural area, can actually avoid some of the super negative aspects of this, because the infection rates were relatively low, and you can start preparing now because you're not dealing with an enormous number of healthcare cases. The cases, however, at the end of the day are going to direct a lot of policy and ultimately the depth and duration of this. How much longer are we going to shelter in place, and in what ways are we going to roll out? And then finally, if we do roll out, we don't want the repeat. That's the absolute critical factor. So in many ways, the rollout will determine how we turn the corner. How we turn the corner will determine how the rest of this year and next year go, and that will determine how well we recover overall. So folks, with that, Vicki, I will hand it back to you, and thank you again, and thanks again to the Alliance for Workforce Development for having me here. Vicki, please.
Oh, okay, thank you, Dr. Eiler. I do not see any questions, and I do see that we are about 2 minutes beyond our 30 minutes that we set aside for this. So I think that if anyone has any specific questions for Dr. Eiler, you could email him, or you could email Tracy Holt, Director for the AFWD, and we will get those answered for you. So just to respect everybody's time, I think that we can sign off now, and thank you again. And the recording for this should be up on AFWD within about 24 hours. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, folks.